Today we are stitching Berry Blossom Buzz. This project combines lace and buttons. It combines teeny tiny little Miyuki beads as well as some embroidery and check beads. It's a really beautiful combination and I can't wait to start this one. So let's get started. For this project, you will need fabric and a hoop. You can choose the size of the hoop and the type of fabric. I'm using a solid fabric. For the beads, I'm using the Miyuki size 11 beads. I've got a mix of reds and greens. I'll be using the Bead Landing 6mm Preciosa, the check crystal beads, and the Sew On Rhinestones. These are the Crystal Lane Sew On Rhinestones. I'll be using a mix of buttons from my stash, some lace and ribbon from my stash. This is optional, but I have a stencil with some circles and a water erasable marker. Thread, I'm using the 12 weight Fruity from Wonderful Specialty Threads, as well as the John Bead Good Thread in white. And then I'll be using the DMC Soft Cotton for the embroidery. So we're going to begin by placing the fabric in the hoop. I always like to just make sure that I have the right amount of fabric by laying the hoop on the fabric. And for this project, I'm just using a standard wooden hoop. Once you have your fabric picked out, you can decide how to best transfer the pattern. You can see that with this fabric, it's a very open weave and a very light fabric. And so I don't even need a light source to transfer my bees onto the fabric. I'm just going to transfer them exactly as is. You might need a light source like a window or a light box. And I'm just going to place 3 bees randomly on my hoop, knowing that I'm going to be including flowers and lace throughout this project. So I want them to be higher up on the fabric and in different positions. Once you have your pattern transferred onto the fabric, you're going to place the fabric in the hoop. Just position it how you want your bees to appear. Once my fabric is in the hoop, I generally don't move it around much, so I like to make sure it's in position when it's hooped up. And then you are going to trim any excess fabric around your hoop, leaving about 2 inches so that you can pull any wrinkles out as you stitch. I like to make sure that the fabric is nice and tight, and just be aware of lines if you have patterns on your fabric, that you're not stretching them out. So we are going to bead the bees first. And for that, I'm using the very tiny Miyuki size 11 beads. These are going to be great for working on the tiny little details that we're going to want to include for our bees. So on the pattern, you'll see that I have a color palette. You can choose to do that, or you can create your own color palette for these bees. I'm going to start with the green for the wings and the little stem or the antenna. So here are the 4 colors that I'm going to be using for my bees. For my thread, I'm going to be using a green Wonderful Specialty Threads. This is a 12 weight thread, so you just want to use something equivalent to that. And I'm going to cut a length of about 12 inches. I knot the end, and then I thread the needle. Now, I might sound like a broken record saying this, but you want to test your needle before threading it, because with the tinier beads, the needle can be a little bit trickier to thread, and so you don't want to go through all the trouble of threading your needle only to find that the bead doesn't fit over the end of it. So I always say to test the needle first. I have a slew of little tiny needles and I just test them first, and then I know, okay, the beads are gonna pass over this. I can thread it. I can spend the time threading it and then get started on my project. When I'm threading my needle, you can see I have the thread squeezed in between my fingers so tightly that you can barely see the thread. And then I bring the eye of the needle to the thread and push it through, and it kind of has nowhere else to go. It has to go through the eye of the needle. So that's just a little tip that helps me in threading my teeny tiniest of needles. So I have traced all 3 bees onto my fabric, and so I'm going to stitch them before putting anything else on here. It's going to help me with the placement of my different laces and of my eyelet flowers. So the bees are the most important step. And I am going to start just over here with the wing. Now, if you look at the pattern, you'll notice there's a little bit of shading along the upper parts of the wing. And so I'm going to do that with just one of my bead colors. I'm going to bring my needle up inside of the wing, and I'm going to be stitching these beads on one at a time, which may feel like a daunting process because it's a larger area that you're covering, but you're going to find that your beads are going to lay so much nicer, and you'll just be happy with how they look stitching them on one at a time. So you're basically bringing your needle up wherever you want a bead, putting it on the needle, and then taking it down just like that. You want your beads to be nice and close together. And now this part of the project is I find this very calming because it's almost like you're just coloring with beads now. You're just filling in your areas of the pattern with the color beads that you want. And that is all there is to this. I'm going to finish this wing and then work on the other one. You can switch up your colors as much as you want. You could use all one color bead, or you could have fun and just really play with the different shades of green in here and give it some variety. So the choice is up to you. This is your little strawberry bee, and yours might look different than mine, and that is totally okay. Okay, so here's what the wing looks like. And now I'm just going to do the same thing over here. And I'm going to stitch these wings and the little crown or the little antennas or the little sprout of each strawberry. So this is what it will look like when you've done just the wings and the little details on the strawberry bees. The next step is to do exactly the same thing, but with the red or pink beads. So for this, I'm using this neon type color for the little bits that I'm going to put around the little strawberry seeds, I guess. And then I'm going to use the other two kind of in a striped pattern like a bee. So I'm going to do that stitching on these 3 bees. One accessory that I use while stitching with the really tiny beads is my Nerge stand. And this is just a desktop stand. And I like it because I can hook the hoop right into here. And then I'm able to stitch freely, not have to use my hands to hold the hoop. And this I find especially helpful when I'm using the really tiny Miyuki beads. So this is the Nerge. It's a tabletop stand. Okay, so here's my little bee, and you can see the very subtle stripes. I wanted it to look striped, but I didn't want it to be super apparent that there were stripes because it's also supposed to look like a strawberry. So I've got that going on. Now for the little accent beads that I'm going to be using as the tiny little seeds throughout this, I'm going to stitch them on slightly different, and I'm going to be coming up in between rows and stitches that I've already added. So I'm just going to bring my needle up, and you can do as many beads as you think would look good, but I try and start with 2 or 3, and I'm putting them all on the needle, and then I'm taking my needle back down in the same exact spot. So these are going to have more dimension on them than the bees which actually lay flat on the fabric. These little, and you might have to kind of play with this to get them to bunch up a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to show this from the side. So you can see from the side when it's completely flat, the bees are stitched flat on the fabric, and then the tiny little accents stand up off of the fabric. So just by, I'll show you one more, just by kind of piling the little beads on, it gives you that dimension, and it's just gonna make your bee look a little more strawberry-like. So again, I'm gonna add 3 beads. That seems to be a good, if you have an even number of beads, you might not get the standing up effect that 3 beads will give you. So I think an odd number of beads, depending on the size of whatever you're working on, works best. So if you decide to do a larger bee, or you're doing this technique on something else, try and keep it with an odd number. And then I'm going to go back down in the same spot. And I don't pull my thread too tight until I know that my beads are about in the position that I want. And there we go. And I'm just going to scatter these throughout the bee. And then I'm going to do the same exact thing over here. And one thing I wanted to mention, when you are done a row of stitching or you're done adding beads, especially with a project like this that's very bead heavy, you just want to make sure that you're running your thread under a few stitches and tying 1 or 2 knots before you trim off your thread. You just want those beads to stay on there nice and securely. Also, if you are using a white fabric like I am, you want to be really careful not to stretch your threads or to carry your threads from one section to another section, because you will see that from behind, especially if it's a more open weave fabric like what I'm using. You can see my fingers behind the fabric. Any threads that you carry, you want to try and keep them contained within the bee or within the shape that you're working on, just so that you don't see them from the front. So this is the sort of project where, depending on your fabric, you just want to be very aware of your threads. Once you have your bees all stitched up, the next part is really fun because you get to go through your laces and your trims. I have so many that I have collected through the years that I really love. This is just a bin of my neutral colors, and I have so many colors. So really this part of the process takes a little bit because it's arranging things that you like. It's pulling out the different textures that you think you might want to use. I will sometimes, normally when I'm doing something like this, I pull out more than I think I will need, because it helps me just to have things to place around and see what it looks like. You can't just picture it. You have to actually go through the process of laying out the trim on your piece. So I have this was cut, I can't remember if this was a dress or a skirt. I'm always saving little bits of things that I love and might want to use at some point. So I'm just going to start kind of layering. I'm going to be adding some eyelet flowers to the top of this. So this is kind of just going to be along the bottom of this piece. And I'm just going to kind of drape them so that they go up a little, which is kind of easy to do with laces and trims because they are kind of movable. So you can just pin things in place. Once I am happy with the position of something, like I really know I want to use this piece, so then I will take my scissors and just cut off the section that I'm going to be using, because then it makes it a little bit easier to kind of position things when you get rid of all of the excess. I know this whole bottom part here I'm not going to be using, so I'm going to cut that off as well. And I know that I only want from about here on up. So this is what you're going to do. You're just going to go through your trims, your laces. You could use ribbon, you can use rickrack, anything that you want to layer. This is the really fun part of using pieces that you may have collected over the years. I know that that's where mine have come from. I can't remember if this is the front or the back, and I don't know that it matters too much because they both look really pretty. So I'm just going to start layering things in place, and I'm not going to fully trim anything until I have a few tacking stitches down and I know that I've definitely got the layout. Once you have everything laid out the way you think you like it, this is where you want to take a picture of it, just like this. Taking a picture of your project helps you to see it more clearly and helps you to see, is there anything that needs adjusting? Does it look good? Are you happy with the placement of things? So I always take a picture first before moving on to the actual stitching things down. To stitch this in place, again, I'm not trimming this yet. I'm using the John Bead Good Thread, and I have my needle threaded. I'm going to be carefully holding things in place. I haven't pinned mine down. You are absolutely welcome to pin yours in place and stitch it. I'm just going to hold a few things in place as I get a few tacking stitches down. And with this thread and the colors of the lace that I'm using, I'm not going to see any of these stitches, but they'll hold everything in place. So I'm just gonna go through here and stitch some things on. I can make my stitches pretty big. I mean, I can carry them pretty far in this part because there's layers, and it will also help me just to get everything stitched into place, and then I can add some finer details to this. Once your piece is tacked down, you are going to want to grab a pair of scissors that can get details. So I'm just using these little Tula Pink snips because they have a super fine tip, and that's what I need for some of these areas. So I left this a little bit loose here just so that I could get in here with the scissors before tacking this part down. And I'm just going to trim kind of in a circle, or following the circle of the hoop, trimming little bits of this off. And when you're looking at a piece of lace like this, you're just going to want to cut it carefully, and it sometimes helps if you cut around a design, like sometimes this has a little floral pattern here. So I'm just really taking my time with that little bit, and it looks like I need to take this little flower off. I always get nervous cutting into lace like this. It's so pretty, and I hate cutting any bits off. But that will be much better. And so now I'll go back with my thread and tack these pieces down, cover this over, trim this, tack these pieces along the edge down, and then do the same thing over here. Once your fabric is trimmed, it really starts to take on a new shape and starts to feel more complete. And this is also when you can go through and really make sure all of the pieces are tacked down to the fabric. So the first time through, we're just kind of loosely tacking the lace down so that we can trim it. And then when we go through this time, it's really making sure that all the fine pieces and the little details are stitched down so that they don't unravel. You don't want the edges coming off. And so that's when you're just going to take the same thread that you've been using the whole time and go through with tinier stitches. So all of my pieces are really tacked down, and looking at them, I'm keeping the colors down here more subtle. The stitches that we are going to be adding up here have a lace-like appearance, and I really want the bees to be the focal point of this piece, so I'm keeping everything subtle. Now, this is just my personal choice. It's working with the fabrics that I have. You might be doing something a little different, but my color choices in everything else I do are going to be reflected in that subtlety. So I'm also looking at the shapes that I have, and I'm going to add a little bit to this because my lace can handle a little bit more down here. So I have, these are the Crystalline Sew On Rhinestones. I love these so much. These are the round ones, and you can see this is just a really pale, I forget what color this is. Oh, it's a light yellow opal. So it really goes with this lace perfectly. And even better is it fits inside of these little flowers down here perfectly. So again, this works for the shape that I'm working with, but even if you don't have shapes like this, clustering some of these together is really fun. Another option, I'll move those away. If you are a collector like me, you might also have buttons galore. This is just my jar of white buttons, and I love adding buttons to my work. So I've pulled out of that jar a few of the buttons. I'm really liking these pearly sort of buttons, and if I'm adding these to the center of the flowers, I think that the buttons might look really nice and kind of balance everything out down here. So you can add buttons just simply by stitching them on. These buttons have a slightly different back, and so I'm going to show you how to stitch those on because I kind of want a little cluster, and I'm just laying things out and seeing what colors do I even like. And when I'm looking at this right now, I've got some off-whites, I've got some white shiny that I really thought I was going to like and I don't like at all. So I think I'm taking those out, and I might take those out of my pile. I thought they were going to look nice and neutral, but they're just a little too, they pick up too much blue, and I'm keeping this light green. I love this sage green color. So I think I'm going to leave those out, but I also love how this pearl goes well with the lace. I feel like it really dresses it up, and so I'm going to add a few of those buttons. So first we're going to stitch on the crystals because I know I really like those, and I'm going to show you how easy these are to stitch on. So I'm using the same John bead thread, but this time I'm going to double it up. These rhinestones have a little bit of weight to them. They're lightweight, they're not heavy at all, but they're more than a seed bead or, you know, a little bugle bead. And so I want to make sure that these stay on my fabric. So I'm just doubling up my thread so that it's like I'm stitching with 2 strands of thread. These rhinestones have 4 holes. So there's 2 on this side, or actually no, they have more. There's 2 on each side, and this has 4 sides. So you can choose to stitch all the sides. You can choose to just stitch through 2 of them. It's really up to you. You can kind of stitch them diagonally, so you can see it goes through that way. So I just begin by laying the crystal on the fabric, and I'm going to hold it in place as I look and see which hole I want to start with stitching. And I'm just going to bring my needle up through the fabric, and I'm going to take it through the hole. And now I have lots of layers of things here, so I'm just being really careful. I have it through both holes now, and now I'm just going to take this end down through the fabric. And just adjust it again before you go through the second hole now. So again, I'm just bringing it up. These are really simple to stitch on and super easy to add to your pieces. And I just absolutely love how this looks with the lace. It like makes it a little bit more elegant. It really dresses it up nicely. And it goes with the shine that's up here too with the bees. So I did those 4 stitches. It feels like it's on pretty good, but I just, because it has a little bit of height and a little bit more height than everything else, I'm just going to go through this side as well. You can't be too safe stitching a larger piece on like this. And that's just going to give me a little extra security. And I'll do this side too. And a bonus, it is helping to tack the lace in place even more. So it's on there really good now. And then to tie it off, I'm just going through a little bit of my fabric and I'm going to tie a knot. So I'm just running it through a few stitches and tying it off. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the other flowers. I'm going to add the rhinestones to that as well. So I'm going to stitch one of the pearl buttons in this area down here. This has a different back. You'll see it has a raised, it almost looks like a bead, and this is a flat button. So the flat buttons are very self-explanatory, easy to stitch on. These, when you're stitching them on fabric, require just a little bit more care and some scissors, which can be a little scary. So I know that I want my button in this area. And so I've got my scissors and I am just going to snip a little hole enough that I can push the button through. You can see it's just a tiny little hole that I've opened there, and I'm going to see if I can get this button through. Sometimes you need to make it a little bit bigger, and sometimes you can just get it through by maneuvering some of the fibers out of the way, which is generally how I like to do it, because then I know that it's not too loose in there. If I really have to push it through, then I know it's already staying in place without me even having to stitch it. So I just have a better sense of security that it's going to stay where I want it to. But I'm still going to stitch it on. So I have my thread doubled up again. And now I'm just going to stitch it from behind. And I'm just going to add, I'm making sure that I'm going through the fabric. And I did this one right near the edge, which is always a little tricky. So I'm going to kind of take it at an angle. You just need to wedge your needle up over the hoop so that you can pull it through. And you're going to be doing this a few times to make sure that it's really secured on your fabric. So just getting it above the hoop and then pulling it through. And I'm going to do that probably 2 or 3 more times. Again, putting it through a very tiny hole makes it feel like it's more secure. If I had cut a hole that was a little too big of an opening, it would be loose in here and I wouldn't have the same security. So I'm just going back and forth, back and forth. It's not my favorite way of stitching buttons on, if I'm being completely honest with you. I don't always love having to stitch them this way, but they lay really flat on the fabric. And I think that it's worth the effort. I mean, how beautiful is that? So I'm going to do the same thing. I have 2 more that I think I'm going to put, I might do 2 or 3 in this area because this is a little bit more open and I just want to even things out. So I've added the beads, the buttons, the lace, the trims. This is exactly how I want this to look. And it gives enough detail down here without overwhelming the rest of this. Again, the bees, the strawberry bees, are my focal point. And so all the rest of the threads that I'm using are kind of in this muted color palette. So they all look really nicely together. There's going to be stitching, but it's going to leave the bees as the focus of the piece. So the thread that I'm using is the DMC soft cotton. You want a thread, we're going to be stitching eyelets, and you want a thread that can give you some thickness, which this has, because it's going to fill in the stitches really nicely and make them feel full. Now you can use, I'm going to be using a little tracer, a little stencil to trace some circles. I find that when I do trace my circles for eyelets, it just helps me to keep them in place. Otherwise your circles can get a little bit wonky. So until you really get the hang of it, just draw a little circle on your fabric, and I'm just using a water-soluble marker. So I'm going to do one that is a 1/2 inch first. I love this ruler. This is a Sue Spargo ruler, and I love that it has the straight edges as well as the circle shapes all in one tool, which is super helpful. And I want one of my flowers up in this area. So I'm just going to lightly draw my circle. It doesn't need to be anything super bright. You can see it. I can see it just fine. And now in that circle, I'm going to cut a little bit of the circle away. And I'm just kind of cutting like a little plus sign or a little X in there. And that fabric is all going to disappear. You can also cut it completely away. And I'm going to do one other thing with this area. I am actually going to cut it all away because I'm going to use some of my lace up here. Now you don't have to do this because it adds just another little layer of trickiness, but it's trickiness in a cool way. So I'm just cutting the circle away, and that's going to leave a bunch of little frayed edges. Now don't worry that it looks rough around there because we are going to be covering this with thread. So I have a ribbon that has a different texture to it. You can see that it kind of matches the fabric, but it's not exactly the same as the fabric. I'm going to cut a small piece of this, a little square of it, and it's going to go behind my eyelet hole that I just cut. So I just want to make sure I'm putting it there. It's definitely going to fit. And now I'm just going to hold it behind this area. So I'm going to bring my needle up. And I'm going to make sure that it's going through that lace or through the ribbon. And this is always the trickiest part of setting up this stitch if I'm backing it with something. And then I'm going to come down here. I'm just doing 4 stitches that are going to hold this in place while I stitch the whole stitch so that I'm not holding it back here with my finger and catching on threads the whole time. This is one of those stitches where you need to just trust me with it and trust the process and know that it's all going to turn out really pretty in the end, because it always looks funky when you are starting it. So trust the process with this one and just be patient with yourself and with the stitch. Okay, so I have my 4 security stitches there holding the ribbon in place so I can let go. That's what it looks like from behind. I'm going to bury these threads inside of this. And now I'm just going to go back to where I started. And I'm going to make, it's almost like you're satin stitching. So my stitches are kind of close together. And I'm going to be working from the outside to the inside, going around in a circle to fill up this whole stitch. Now, if you weren't doing it with a piece of ribbon behind it, you would just have an open hole here, and that's your eyelet. So you recognize that from clothing and from fabric. It's an open stitch, which I can stitch one of those too. I like to have a variety here, especially if this is going to be a neutral colored garden that I'm adding. I like the variety that I'm going to have. And you can see how this thread is just, it's covering up the blue line that I had marking my circle. It's hiding the edges of the ribbon from behind, which you can see on this fabric because again, I'm working with an open weave fabric. So it's hiding that. So I've come all the way back around and I've met up with my very first stitch. And that's what it looks like when you've created an eyelet and you've backed it with ribbon. So to finish that off, I'm just running my needle through that stitch. I could do that a few times. Because this has no beads and it's a thicker thread, that is exactly what I need. So you could stitch a variety of these all over. I'll show you one more that is just an open hole in the back, like an open eyelet, but a variety of those would look really cool here. You could make them a lot smaller than this. You could make them bigger than this. If you're making the hole bigger, you just want to be aware of your threads though, because especially if it's open, you're going to see whatever is behind there. So you just want to make sure that you're carrying your threads that way and that they're not crossing over the circle, because that defeats the purpose. And then you see those threads from the front. So here's what the eyelet will look like if you don't back it with anything. And I think a variety of these in different sizes will look really nice, and it starts to resemble flowers in a garden. So once you have some flowers, you're going to want to add stems. One of my favorite ways to add a stem is to do the feather stitch. So I'm doing the feather stitch in the same color as my background fabric, because again, remember, focal point bees. I've got a lot of empty space here, which I can add beads, I can add more flowers, but I want to add some stems before I go any further. The stems aren't going to exactly connect with my flowers, but there's going to be the illusion of stems. It's not a very realistic garden. I mean, we do have bees that are strawberries after all. So I'm bringing my thread up, and now we're going to imagine I'm stitching this from top to bottom. We're going to imagine a line drawn on either side, and the thread right now is considered the middle area. So I'm taking it down on the side, and I'm not going to pull it all the way through because I'm coming back up again in this middle area. And then once I come up, I can bring my thread all the way through because now it's secured. And now I'm going to take it down on the other side. And I'm not going to pull all the way through because I'm coming up in the middle again. Now you don't have to be worried with this stitch that your lines, your imaginary lines, are exactly even, because this is a stitch that's allowed to get a little wonky, and that's what's cool about it. So this stitch can kind of travel and not create intentional straight lines, and that's one of my favorite ways to use it, especially in a botanical piece. So you can also wander it off to the side and not just go back and forth, as long as with each stitch you're anchoring it before you pull all of your thread through. So I can continue bringing it over this way, then I can work my way back. I can work my way around any little flowers that I have stitched here. To the ends of the feather stitch, I can add beads, which I am going to do with these small, the Bead Landing Preciosa crystal beads. I'm just going to stitch these on exactly the same way that we stitched the rhinestones on. And I don't have to add a lot of them. I'm just adding little bits of sparkle here and there. You could also use those if you wanted to add a little sparkle down in this area. And I've chosen colors that are muted, but will still give some shine. And so I'm just working this stitch all around until I get to the bottom of where my lace starts. Choosing a thread the same color as the background fabric is another one of my favorite ways to do the feather stitch, just because it fills up the background without making it look too busy. So there are stitches that are on the fabric, but it's not like your eye is focusing on them. You notice them, but you're not seeing them the whole time because you're picking out all of the other things. And your idea with a project like this is to make the whole thing feel cohesive. And so it's just blending everything together. It's giving it some grounding points along the way. So I'm just going to stitch it all the way to the bottom. And then to end my stitch, I'm actually going to, I think, just do one more here. To end my stitch, I'm just bringing my thread down on the other side to anchor that, just like that. And then I'll wind that through the same way that I end all of my stitches. So I'm going to add a few more flowers, a few more feather stitches, and then our hoop is going to be done. Here's what it looks like when it's done. I have exactly what I wanted. The bees are my focal point. There is embroidery on this piece, and there's a grounding down here, but the bees are the focal point, and I'm thrilled with how they turned out. The eyelets look great with the Preciosa crystals and the crystals down here, and the combination of everything, it just makes me so happy. So to finish this up, I have trimmed the fabric so that it folds over and doesn't touch this fabric. And then when I've done that, I take a little bit of Elmer's glue or school glue and just run a strip all the way around the hoop, and then fold the fabric over and let it dry. I hope you have enjoyed stitching these strawberry bees as much as I did, adding the textures of lace and the ribbon, as well as the open stitches, really combined together to make such a cool project. So enjoy and happy stitching!